today's story is going to be the story of Jacob. And that story starts on page 42 in your Spark Bible. And it is Genesis chapter 25, verse 19 through chapter 33, verse 20 in your Standard Bible. Remember, Isaac married Rebekah. And Rebekah and Isaac had two children. They were twins named Jacob and Esau. Esau was a little bit older, just a few minutes older than Jacob. So he was considered the firstborn son. And he was the son who would have been entitled to the blessing that allowed him to inherit everything that Isaac had. Jacob didn't like this idea. So he came up with a plan. And his plan was to trick his father into giving him the blessing instead of Esau, because once the blessing was given, it couldn't be taken back. So Isaac actually got his mother to make a stew. It was this stew that Isaac really, really liked. And he was going to go in and serve it to his father and pretend that he was Esau. But to pretend that he was Esau, he had to put some extra hair on his arm, because Esau was very hairy and Jacob wasn't really very hairy. But Isaac was very old and almost blind, and the only way he could tell the difference between Jacob and Esau was by touching his arm and feeling the hair on his arm. So he took the stew in and he put the animal hair on his arm. And his father said to him, "Thank you, Esau, I give you my blessing." And he gave his blessing to Jacob instead of Esau. When Esau found out, he was very, very angry. And Jacob knew that he would have to leave. Rebekah said to Jacob, "You have to go or Esau's going to kill you. Travel back to Haran, where I'm from, and go and meet my family there, and they'll help you find a wife." So Isaac traveled across the desert back to Haran. And in Haran, he came to a well. Remember, wells are special places where special things happen. And he met his uncle. His name was Laban. And Laban had a daughter, Rachel, that Jacob really liked. And so he wanted to marry Rachel, but he couldn't marry Rachel. Laban decided he couldn't marry Rachel because Rachel was younger. He had to marry the older sister first. The older sister's name was Leah. And Jacob, he didn't really like Leah. He liked Rachel. But Laban said, "If you work for me for 7 years, you can marry Rachel." So Jacob worked for Laban on his lands and with his animals for 7 years. And he went to marry Rachel. Now, in those days, the lady came out in a wedding veil that covered her from head to toe. You couldn't see her face. You couldn't see anything. So Jacob thought he was marrying Rachel. But after the ceremony was over and they took the veil off, he had actually married Leah. Now, he wasn't very happy about that. And Laban said, "Well, you can marry Rachel too, but you have to work for me for 7 more years. And it was common in those days. People would marry more than one person because they wanted to have a lot of children. And a lot of times women died when they were having babies. So he agreed to work for 7 more years, and he worked for 7 more years for Laban, and then he married Rachel. In his travels to find Leah and Rachel, Isaac had crossed back across the desert that Abraham had crossed to get to Hebron in the first place. And in those travels to find Leah and Rachel, he slept a lot in the desert, and he had dreams. And in those dreams, God told him that all this land that you're crossing, I'm going to give all of this land to your family. He stopped in all of those places that Abraham had crossed, specifically Bethel, where God came to him. And then there was another place along a riverbank called Peniel, where Jacob had a particular dream that he was wrestling with an angel. He didn't know it was an angel. He just thought it was a person who was sort of coming after him. But when the dream was over, he realized that it was an angel and that it was God, and that in this wrestling with this angel and struggling with this angel where he hurt his hip, it had changed him, and that he would no longer be called Isaac. He would no longer be called Jacob. He would be called Israel. So when he was Israel and married to Rachel and Leah, they had 12 children. They had 13 children, actually. They had 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Zebulon, Benjamin, Issachar, Joseph, and they had a daughter, Dinah. The 12 sons would go out later and control all of that land that Jacob had crossed to find Rachel and Leah. Because after he was married, he took Rachel and Leah back to his family, back to Hebron. And Esau forgave him, and when he saw the great family he had, they divided up all the land. And each one of these sons would control a part of the land, and they would come to be known as the 12 tribes. The 12 tribes of Israel, of their father, and they were collectively called the Hebrews because they came out of Hebron. So this is part of the story of how we got, remember Abraham and Sarah, two old people who never thought they would have children. Their grandchild went on to have all of these children who would go on to lead a great nation called Israel under God. But they wouldn't stay where they were. Things would happen and they would have to move around, and eventually Joseph would end up in Egypt. And that'll be our next set of stories.